The rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Tavern, a dimly lit establishment tucked between a used bookstore and a small organic cafe in downtown Portland. Steam rose from coffee cups and whiskey glasses as conversations hummed throughout the cozy space. In the back corner, beneath flickering Edison bulbs, two men sat across from each other at a worn wooden table, their presence somehow commanding attention despite their quiet demeanor. Francis Bacon adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and took a measured sip of his bourbon. His crisp white shirt and dark blazer suggested someone accustomed to academic halls, yet his weathered hands spoke of a life spent grappling with complex problems. Across from him, an elderly Chinese man in simple grey clothing sat with perfect posture, his serene expression unchanged by the bustling atmosphere around them. This was Master Lao, though most knew him simply as an old sage who appeared at philosophical gatherings around the city. The evening had begun with a lecture at Portland State University titled Technology and Environmental Ethics in the 21st Century. Both men had attended, though neither had spoken during the formal presentation. It was afterward, as rain began to fall and crowds dispersed, that they found themselves walking in the same direction, drawn into conversation about the fundamental questions that had been left unanswered in the academic setting. "You know," Bacon said, setting down his glass with deliberate precision, "I've spent my entire career arguing that knowledge is the path to human improvement. Tonight's discussion barely scratched the surface of what's really at stake here." Master Lao smiled gently, his fingers wrapped around a cup of green tea that seemed to maintain its warmth despite the cool evening air. "The surface often reveals the depths to those who know how to look. But tell me, Professor Bacon, what do you believe is truly at stake?" The question hung in the air between them, like the tobacco smoke that occasionally drifted from the bar area. Bacon leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the amber light of the hanging bulbs. "Human survival, for starters. Our planet faces unprecedented challenges. Climate change, resource depletion, disease, hunger. We have the scientific knowledge and technological capability to address these problems, but we're hamstrung by romantic notions about leaving nature untouched." "Romantic notions," Master Lao repeated slowly, savoring the words like fine wine. "Or perhaps ancient wisdom that recognizes what modern humans have forgotten." Around them, the tavern continued its evening rhythm. A group of graduate students debated social justice over craft beer at a nearby table. The bartender wiped down glasses with mechanical precision. A jazz quartet set up their instruments on the small stage near the front windows. But the conversation between these two men seemed to exist in its own sphere, as if the very air around their table had grown dense with philosophical possibility. Bacon's expression sharpened. "I've read Thoreau, if that's what you're getting at. I understand the appeal of Walden Pond, of finding meaning in simple communion with nature, but that's a luxury afforded to those who don't face the daily reality of human suffering. When a child dies of malaria, when crops fail and families starve, when hurricanes devastate entire communities, that's when we need science, technology, and yes, the systematic understanding and control of natural forces." Master Lao nodded thoughtfully, showing no sign of offense at the implicit criticism. "And yet, is it not often our attempts at control that create the very problems you describe? The child dies of malaria in regions where ecosystems have been disrupted by development. The crops fail because industrial agriculture has depleted the soil. The hurricanes grow stronger as human activity alters the climate." "Temporary setbacks," Bacon replied, though his tone carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Every scientific advance faces initial challenges. The solution isn't to abandon progress, but to pursue it more intelligently. We've barely begun to unlock nature's secrets. Genetic engineering could eliminate hereditary diseases. Renewable energy could power civilization without environmental damage. Artificial intelligence could solve complex ecological problems faster than any human mind." The older man's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement. "You speak of unlocking nature's secrets as if she were a vault to be cracked open. But what if nature has no secrets, only patterns that reveal themselves to those who learn to listen rather than interrogate?" Their server approached to refill drinks, moving with practiced efficiency around the philosophical tension that had settled over the table. Neither man spoke until she had moved on, but the brief interruption only seemed to heighten the weight of their exchange. "Listen," Bacon said finally, "I appreciate poetry as much as anyone, but poetry doesn't build hospitals or develop vaccines. It doesn't feed the hungry or provide clean water. Human ingenuity does. Human effort does. The systematic application of scientific method does. Master Lao lifted his teacup with both hands, a gesture that somehow transformed the simple act into something approaching ceremony. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the question is not whether we should act, but how we understand our place in the great pattern of existence." The stage lights dimmed as the jazz quartet began their first set, and the conversation between the two philosophers deepened, their voices weaving through the music like complementary melodies exploring the same eternal themes. The saxophone's mellow tones provided a backdrop as Bacon leaned back in his chair, studying the man across from him with genuine curiosity. Despite their fundamental disagreement, something about Master Lao's presence commanded respect. Not the aggressive intellectual respect demanded by academic debate, but something quieter and more profound. "You mentioned patterns," Bacon said, his voice cutting through the ambient music. "I'm curious about that, because observation of patterns is precisely what separates modern science from medieval superstition. We don't just look at nature, we question it systematically, test our hypotheses, replicate results. This methodology has given us everything from antibiotics to space travel." Master Lao set down his teacup with the same deliberate care he seemed to bring to every movement. "And what has it cost?" "Cost?" Bacon's eyebrows rose. "The scientific method has extended human lifespan by decades. It's eliminated diseases that plagued our ancestors. It's connected the globe through communication technology. If there are costs, they're far outweighed by the benefits." "I think of a river I knew in my youth," Master Lao said, his gaze drifting toward the rain-streaked windows. "It wound through valleys and forests, providing water for countless creatures, flooding and receding with the seasons, carrying sediments that enrich the soil. Engineers came and straightened it, deepened it, built dams to control its flow. Now it moves faster, yes, and carries more cargo ships, but the wetlands have dried up. The fish populations have collapsed, and when the great rains come, the concrete channels cannot contain the fury they have created." Bacon shifted uncomfortably. "That's an engineering problem, not a fundamental flaw in scientific thinking. Better engineering, informed by ecological science, could have prevented those issues. You're conflating poor implementation with the method itself." "Am I?" Master Lao smiled. "Or am I suggesting that the very idea of implementation reveals a misunderstanding? The engineers saw the river as a problem to be solved, rather than a teacher to be studied. They asked, how can we make this river serve our purposes, instead of, how can we work with this river's nature to meet our needs?" The conversation paused as laughter erupted from the graduate student table, where someone had apparently made a joke about their professor's research methodology. The sound seemed to emphasize the serious nature of the discussion between Bacon and Master Lao, highlighting how their debate touched on fundamental questions that academic humor couldn't quite reach. Bacon took a longer sip of his bourbon, using the moment to gather his thoughts. "Look, I understand the appeal of working with nature's nature, as you put it, but that's essentially a passive approach in a world that demands active solutions. Climate change won't be solved by meditation and mindfulness. It requires massive technological intervention, carbon capture, renewable energy infrastructure, possibly even geoengineering projects. We need to act decisively and scientifically." "Decisive action," Master Lao mused. "Tell me, Professor, when you were young, did you ever try to catch butterflies?" Bacon looked puzzled by the apparent non sequitur. "I suppose so, yes. Most children do. And how did that work when you chased them directly, trying to grab them with your hands?" "They flew away, obviously, but I'm not sure I see the relevance. But if you sat very still in a garden with patience and awareness, they might land on your shoulder without any effort on your part." Master Lao's eyes sparkled with gentle mischief. "Some solutions come not from pursuing them aggressively, but from creating the conditions where they naturally arise." Bacon frowned, clearly wrestling with the implications. "That's a beautiful metaphor, but we're talking about existential threats to human civilization. We can't just sit in the garden, hoping the solutions will land on our shoulders. People are dying right now from problems we have the knowledge to solve." "Are they dying from the problems, or from our solutions to previous problems?" Master Lao asked quietly. "The great smog that chokes your cities comes largely from the coal and oil that powers your industries. The plastic that fills your oceans was created to solve packaging problems. The pesticides that poison your soil were designed to increase crop yields. Each solution becomes tomorrow's problem, requiring ever more complex solutions." The bartender called last orders, though it was still early enough that most patrons showed no intention of leaving. The jazz quartet transitioned into a slower, more contemplative piece, that seemed to match the deepening mood of the philosophical exchange. "You're describing a cycle," Bacon admitted, "but that doesn't invalidate the scientific approach. It means we need better science, more comprehensive understanding. We need to anticipate consequences more thoroughly, develop cleaner technologies, create closed-loop systems that minimize waste. More control," Master Lao said simply. "Smarter control, more informed control. Control guided by wisdom and ethics, not just immediate utility." Master Lao was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire table. "There is a difference between wisdom and cleverness, Professor Bacon. Cleverness creates tools. Wisdom knows when not to use them." The jazz quartet had finished their set, leaving the tavern filled with the softer sounds of conversation and clinking glasses. Bacon found himself studying Master Lao's weathered hands as they rested calmly on the table, noting the stark contrast with his own slightly trembling fingers. Whether from caffeine, alcohol, or the intensity of their discussion, he couldn't be sure. "Wisdom knows when not to use tools," Bacon repeated slowly. "But doesn't that position essentially argue for ignorance? For deliberately limiting human potential? Every medical breakthrough requires countless researchers choosing to use their tools rather than walking away from difficult problems." Master Lao lifted his teacup, inhaling the steam before responding. "A master carpenter has many tools, Professor, but he does not use his chisel when he needs his saw, nor does he pound nails with his plane. The tool serves the purpose, not the reverse." "Fair enough, but the analogy breaks down when we're talking about the scale of modern challenges. Take genetic engineering. We now have the ability to eliminate hereditary diseases, to enhance human intelligence, to extend lifespan significantly. Are you suggesting we should walk away from these capabilities out of some misguided reverence for natural limitations?" "I am suggesting," Master Lao said carefully, "that every power carries within it the seed of its own destruction. The greater the power, the greater the responsibility to understand not just what can be done, but what should be done, and what should be left undone." Bacon leaned forward, his academic instincts fully engaged. "But who makes those determinations? You're essentially advocating for a philosophy that could justify any form of scientific restraint. Religious fundamentalists use similar arguments to oppose stem cell research. Political extremists invoke natural order to justify all manner of social inequalities. True wisdom distinguishes between restraint born of fear and restraint born of understanding." Master Lao's response came without defensiveness, as if he had considered these objections many times before. "The river does not rage against its banks from fear, but follows its nature. When humans redirect it with violence, both the water and the land suffer." "And yet," Bacon countered, his voice gaining intensity, "when humans redirected rivers intelligently, they created irrigation systems that fed millions. When they learned to harness electricity, they lit the darkness. When they developed antibiotics, they conquered infections that had killed our ancestors for millennia. Your river metaphor is poetic, but it ignores the tremendous human flourishing that scientific progress has enabled." The conversation paused as a couple at a nearby table began arguing about their relationship, their raised voices cutting through the tavern's atmosphere. Both philosophers glanced over, then returned their attention to each other, the interruption somehow emphasizing the civilized nature of their own disagreement. "Human flourishing," Master Lao said thoughtfully. "Tell me, Professor, do you consider yourself a flourishing human being?" The question caught Bacon off guard. He had expected continued discussion of methodology and consequences, not this sudden turn toward the personal. Yes, I suppose I do. I have meaningful work, intellectual challenges, the respect of my peers. I contribute to knowledge that benefits society." "And are you at peace?" Bacon's hand moved unconsciously to his phone, checking for messages he already knew weren't there. "Peace is a luxury in a world with so many urgent problems requiring attention. I have responsibilities." Responsibilities to whom? To future generations, to the advancement of knowledge, to the alleviation of human suffering. Bacon's voice carried conviction, but also a note of weariness that he hadn't intended to reveal. Master Lao nodded slowly. "Noble purposes. And yet, if you cannot find peace within yourself, how can you create it in the world? If you are driven by urgency and anxiety, will not your solutions carry those same qualities?" "That's rather presumptuous," Bacon replied, though without real anger. "You're suggesting that my psychological state somehow invalidates the objective value of scientific research. The laws of physics don't change based on whether the physicist is having a good day. No, but the physicist's choice of which laws to investigate and how to apply that knowledge certainly does. Master Lao smiled gently. I do not question your dedication or your intelligence, Professor. I question whether the frantic pace of modern problem-solving allows for the deep reflection that true solutions require. Bacon fell silent, turning his bourbon glass in slow circles on the table. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and he found himself thinking about the last time he had simply sat and listened to rain without simultaneously planning his next research project or reviewing grant applications. The irony, he said finally, is that I became a scientist because I wanted to understand the natural world. I spent my childhood fascinated by birds and insects, by the way light moved through water, by the patterns of leaves and clouds. Somewhere along the way, that wonder got buried under methodologies and publications and the pressure to produce actionable results. It need not stay buried, Master Lao said quietly. But wonder without action feels like self-indulgence when children are dying of preventable diseases, when species are going extinct, when the climate systems that support civilization are breaking down. How do I reconcile wonder with responsibility? Master Lao was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Bacon became aware of the layered sounds around them, conversations at other tables, the hiss of the espresso machine, the distant rumble of traffic on wet streets. When the older man finally spoke, his words seemed to emerge from that same deep stillness. Perhaps the question is not how to reconcile them, but how to discover that they were never separate. The tavern had grown quieter as the evening progressed, with several tables now empty and the remaining patrons speaking in hushed tones that suggested deeper, more intimate conversations. The bartender moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning glasses and organizing bottles for the following day. Bacon found himself unexpectedly comfortable in this space between day and night, between certainty and questioning. Never separate, he repeated, rolling the phrase around like wine on his tongue. You're suggesting that wonder and responsibility are somehow the same thing. Master Lao poured himself another cup of tea from the small pot that had appeared at their table sometime during the evening. The ritual of pouring, the careful attention to each movement, seemed to create its own form of meditation. Consider a mother bird building her nest. She gathers twigs and moss with great care, responding to the needs of eggs not yet laid. Is this wonder or responsibility? Both, I suppose, but instinct primarily. She's following genetic programming developed over millions of years of evolution. And what do you suppose shaped that programming? Master Lao asked. What force taught countless generations of birds the optimal placement of each twig, the proper thickness of each wall, the ideal height above ground? Bacon considered the question seriously. Natural selection, environmental pressures over time, birds with poor nest-building skills were less likely to reproduce successfully. Indeed, the great teacher that never speaks, never commands, yet instructs every creature in the art of living. Master Lao's eyes reflected the warm light of the Edison bulbs. The bird learns not through textbooks or lectures, but through intimate relationship with wind and weather, predator and season. Her knowledge and her love are inseparable. But humans have moved beyond instinct, Bacon protested. We have the capacity for abstract reasoning, for imagining futures that don't yet exist, for solving problems that evolution never anticipated. That's precisely what makes us responsible for managing our environment, rather than simply adapting to it. Have we moved beyond, or have we forgotten how to listen? Master Lao asked. Your sciences discover what the ancient farmers knew through generations of careful observation, that certain plants grow well together, that soil needs rest between crops, that diversity creates stability. But your modern agriculture ignores these lessons in favor of short-term efficiency. Bacon felt a familiar frustration rising, the same feeling he experienced when well-meaning but scientifically illiterate politicians made policy decisions based on folk wisdom rather than peer-reviewed research. Ancient farmers also died regularly from famines that modern agricultural science has largely eliminated. Their methods might have been sustainable in the short term, but they couldn't feed the world's current population, could they not? Or have we created a population that requires unsustainable methods to feed? Master Lao asked the question without accusation, as if genuinely curious about Bacon's perspective. The question hung in the air like incense, complex and multi-layered. Bacon found himself thinking about global population projections, about the Green Revolution's successes and failures, about the complex relationships between agricultural policy, economic development, and environmental degradation. That's a profound question, he admitted finally, but it assumes we have some kind of moral authority to determine optimal population levels. The people who exist deserve to live, to eat, to flourish. We can't simply declare that there are too many humans and walk away from the technological solutions that support them. No, but we might ask why there seems to be too little of everything else, Master Lao replied. Too little topsoil, too little fresh water, too little biodiversity, too little peace. Perhaps the problem is not that humans need more efficient ways to consume resources, but that they have forgotten their place in the larger web of existence. A couple at a nearby table was sharing a piece of chocolate cake, taking turns feeding each other with obvious delight. Their simple pleasure seemed to underscore the weight of the philosophical discussion happening just a few feet away. Bacon watched them for a moment, remembering similar moments with his own wife before academic pressures had consumed so much of his attention. Place in the web of existence, he said slowly. I understand the appeal of that perspective, but it strikes me as fundamentally passive. If an asteroid were heading toward Earth, would you counsel humanity to accept its place in the cosmic web rather than developing the technology to deflect it? Master Lao smiled. I would counsel humanity to ask why it had developed the wisdom to see the asteroid's approach, and whether that same wisdom might reveal the appropriate response. That's not an answer. That's mysticism disguised as philosophy, is it? Your own sciences teach that the universe tends toward complexity and consciousness. Stars collapse to create the heavy elements necessary for life. Gravity draws matter together to form planets. Random chemical reactions somehow give rise to cells that divide and grow, and eventually wonder about their own existence. Master Lao's voice carried a sense of genuine awe. If consciousness arose naturally from unconscious matter, might it not have a natural role to play in the cosmos? Bacon felt his scientific training wrestling with something deeper, less quantifiable. You're suggesting that human consciousness exists to serve some cosmic purpose? I am suggesting that human consciousness might be the universe's way of knowing itself, of caring for itself, of healing itself. But this requires a different kind of knowledge than your instruments can measure. What kind of knowledge? Master Lao was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain that continued its steady rhythm against the windows. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from that same eternal source as the falling water, the knowledge that comes from being part of what you seek to understand. The tavern's atmosphere had shifted as the night deepened. The harsh electric lights had been dimmed, replaced by the warmer glow of candles that appeared on each occupied table. The change created an intimacy that seemed to draw the remaining patrons into quieter, more personal conversations. Even the background music had faded to barely audible levels, leaving space for reflection and deeper listening. Bacon found himself studying the candle flame at their table, watching how it danced in response to invisible air currents. There was something mesmerizing about its movement, predictable yet never quite the same from moment to moment. The knowledge that comes from being part of what you seek to understand, he repeated. But doesn't that compromise objectivity? Scientific method depends on maintaining distance between observer and observed. Does it? Master Lao asked. Or does it depend on understanding the relationship between observer and observed? Your quantum physicists have discovered that the act of observation changes what is observed. Perhaps what you call objectivity is simply a more subtle form of participation. Bacon shifted uncomfortably. He had spent years defending scientific objectivity against postmodern critiques that threatened to undermine the foundation of empirical knowledge. Quantum mechanics doesn't invalidate scientific method. It refines our understanding of measurement at subatomic scales. At the macro level, we can still maintain meaningful separation between subject and object. Can we? When you study climate change, are you separate from the climate? When you develop new technologies, are you separate from their consequences? When you seek to cure disease, are you separate from the community that experiences health and illness? Master Lao's questions came gently, without the aggressive edge that Bacon had learned to expect from academic debate. Those are practical connections, not epistemological ones. I can acknowledge my stake in the outcomes while still maintaining scientific rigor in the research process. And yet your research shapes what you choose to study, how you interpret results, which applications seem most urgent. Master Lao poured more tea, the steam rising between them like incense. The scientist who grows up in poverty focuses on different problems than one who grows up in wealth. The researcher whose child has cancer approaches medical questions differently than one whose family is healthy. Bacon felt the truth of this observation in his chest, remembering how his own research priorities had shifted after his father's death from complications that better medical technology might have prevented. That's true, but it doesn't invalidate the research itself. Personal motivation can lead to important discoveries. I do not suggest it invalidates anything, Master Lao said. I suggest it reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. What you call objective truth might be better understood as collective subjectivity, the shared understanding that emerges when many conscious beings participate deeply in the mystery they seek to comprehend. A couple at another table was arguing quietly about whether to have children, their voices carrying the weight of uncertainty about the kind of world they might be bringing new life into. Their conversation seemed to echo themes that had been running beneath the surface of the evening's philosophical exchange. Collective subjectivity, Bacon mused. That's essentially democratic science, truth determined by consensus rather than empirical verification. But consensus can be wrong. People once agreed that the Earth was flat, that disease was caused by bad air, that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Indeed, and what changed those understandings? Better observation, more careful experimentation, improved instrumentation. And who performed those observations and experiments? Master Lao asked. Scientists, researchers, people willing to question accepted wisdom. People, Master Lao emphasized. Conscious beings embedded in the world they studied, driven by curiosity and wonder, and sometimes by the pain of seeing their communities suffer from false beliefs. The better observation came not from removing themselves from the world, but from engaging more deeply with it. Bacon paused, recognizing something important in the distinction. You're saying that scientific progress comes from deeper participation, not greater separation. I am saying that what you call scientific progress and what I call wisdom may be different names for the same movement toward truth, but this movement requires something your methodology often overlooks, which is humility. The word settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything they had discussed. Bacon felt his defensive instincts rising, then subsiding as he recognized the accuracy of the observation. Humility, he repeated quietly, the assumption that we don't know everything we need to know. The assumption that the universe is more intelligent than any human understanding of it, Master Lao clarified. Your technologies are powerful, Professor, but they are also crude compared to the elegant solutions that emerge from millions of years of natural selection. A single leaf performs photosynthesis with greater efficiency than your best solar panels. A bird's wing creates lift with less energy expenditure than any aircraft. A mycorrhizal network shares resources between trees with more sophistication than your internet protocols. But we're learning to mimic those natural solutions, Bacon protested. Biomimicry is an active area of research. We're developing better solar cells based on plant photosynthesis, more efficient aircraft based on bird flight patterns. Yes, you are copying nature's homework, Master Lao said with gentle humor, but are you understanding nature's teacher? What do you mean? What intelligence guided the development of photosynthesis? What consciousness designed the wing? What wisdom created systems so elegant that human technology can only hope to approximate them after decades of study? Bacon felt himself at the edge of something vast and uncertain, like standing on a cliff in fog, where the next step might be solid ground or empty air. You're personifying natural processes. Evolution doesn't require consciousness or intention, does it not? Or does consciousness and intention require evolution to manifest in forms we can recognize? The candle at their table had burned low, its flame smaller but somehow more intense, casting dancing shadows that made both men's faces appear younger and older simultaneously. The tavern had emptied considerably, leaving only a few dedicated patrons who seemed, like Bacon and Master Lao, to be engaged in conversations that had transcended ordinary social boundaries. Consciousness requiring evolution, Bacon said slowly, rather than evolution producing consciousness. That's a fundamental inversion of scientific materialism. Is it inversion, or simply a different perspective on the same phenomenon? Master Lao asked. Your physics teaches that matter and energy are two expressions of the same underlying reality. Perhaps consciousness and cosmos are similarly related. Bacon found himself thinking about recent developments in neuroscience, about the hard problem of consciousness that continued to elude scientific explanation despite advances in brain imaging and computational modeling. Even if that were true, it doesn't resolve the practical question we started with. Whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, we still face urgent environmental and social problems that require human intervention. Indeed. But what kind of intervention? Master Lao leaned back in his chair, his posture somehow conveying both relaxation and alertness. When a fever patient writhes in discomfort, the caring physician must decide whether to suppress the fever or support the body's natural healing process. Sometimes the fever itself is the cure, and sometimes the fever kills the patient, Bacon replied sharply. Medical intervention has saved countless lives that natural healing processes would have lost. True. But has it also created new forms of vulnerability? Bodies that cannot fight infection without pharmaceutical support, populations dependent on technologies they do not understand, systems so complex that small failures cascade into large disasters. The question hung between them like the smoke from the bar area, visible but intangible. Bacon thought about antibiotic resistance, about supply chain vulnerabilities, about the increasing specialization that left most people unable to perform basic tasks their grandparents had taken for granted. You're describing trade-offs, he said finally. Every technology involves trade-offs. The question is whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And who makes that calculation? Master Lao asked. The pharmaceutical company that profits from ongoing dependence. The government agency whose funding depends on continued crisis. The individual scientist whose career requires publishing positive results. Independent researchers. Peer review, replication studies. The scientific community has developed mechanisms for minimizing bias and self-interest. Has it? Or has it developed mechanisms for distributing bias and self-interest more widely? Master Lao's tone carried no accusation, only genuine curiosity. When the entire community depends on the same funding sources, shares the same basic assumptions about progress and human nature, faces the same publish or perish pressures, does peer review eliminate bias or simply systematize it? Bacon felt a familiar frustration, but also a grudging recognition of the criticism's validity. He had seen too many promising research directions abandoned because they couldn't attract funding, too many negative results buried because they contradicted profitable applications. The system isn't perfect, he admitted, but it's better than relying on tradition or intuition or mystical revelation. At least scientific knowledge can be tested and corrected over time. Can it? Or does each generation of technology create new problems that require even more complex solutions, making it impossible to return to simpler approaches, even when they prove superior? Master Lao gestured toward Bacon's smartphone, which sat face down on the table between them. Your device connects you to the sum of human knowledge, yet studies show that people are lonelier, more anxious, less capable of sustained attention than before such tools existed. Bacon glanced at his phone, realizing he had been unconsciously reaching for it throughout the evening, whenever the conversation hit uncomfortable territory. Technology isn't inherently good or bad, it depends on how we use it. Does it? Or does technology shape how we think about using it? Master Lao picked up Bacon's phone, holding it gently like a small animal. This device was designed to capture and hold your attention. The algorithms that drive its applications profit from keeping you engaged, regardless of whether that engagement serves your well-being. Can you use it wisely when its very architecture is designed to undermine wisdom? People can learn to use technology more mindfully. We can develop better digital literacy, create healthier relationships with our devices. While swimming against a current designed by teams of engineers and psychologists specifically to prevent such mindful usage, Master Lao set the phone back down. It is possible, yes, but does it represent a sustainable solution, or merely individual resistance to systemic problems? A young woman at a nearby table was crying quietly, while her companion offered comfort, their intimate drama playing out against the background of philosophical discussion. Bacon found himself wondering what personal crisis had brought them to this late-night refuge, what forms of intervention or non-intervention might best serve their healing. Systemic problems, he said. You're arguing that the entire technological approach is fundamentally flawed, not just poorly implemented. I am asking whether solutions that require constant vigilance to prevent their harmful effects truly qualify as solutions, Master Lao replied. The river that must be continuously dammed and channeled and managed, or it floods and destroys, versus the river that naturally finds its optimal course and supports life along its banks without human oversight. But natural rivers do flood destructively. Natural systems do collapse. Evolution itself is full of dead ends and extinctions. The natural world isn't a harmonious paradise. It's red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson said. Master Lao nodded thoughtfully. Yes, nature includes destruction as well as creation, death as well as birth. The question is whether human intervention reduces this destruction or merely redirects it in ways that create even greater future instability. Climate engineering might prevent some species extinctions while inadvertently triggering others. Genetic modification might eliminate certain diseases while creating new vulnerabilities. Each technological solution carries unforeseen consequences that require additional technological responses. Precisely. And at what point does the cure become worse than the disease? The candle had nearly burned to its base, leaving only a small pool of wax and a flickering flame that cast barely enough light to illuminate their faces. The tavern was almost empty now, with only the bartender and one other couple remaining besides Bacon and Master Lao. The intimate setting seemed to draw their conversation toward something approaching conclusion, though neither man appeared ready to declare victory or defeat in their philosophical contest. The cure becoming worse than the disease, Bacon said quietly, watching the dying flame. I've thought about that more in the past few hours than I have in years of research. But even if you're right about the risks of technological intervention, what's the alternative? Passive acceptance of preventable suffering? Master Lao was silent for a long moment, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent contemplating such questions. There is a difference between passive acceptance and active non-interference. The skilled gardener knows when to water, when to prune, when to simply watch and trust the plant's own wisdom. But humans aren't plants. We have complex societies, abstract needs, moral obligations that extend beyond immediate survival. Do we? Or have we created complex stories about complex societies that obscure simpler truths? Master Lao asked. The child who is hungry needs food, not economic theories about food distribution. The person who is lonely needs connection, not social media platforms that simulate connection while preventing it. Bacon felt something shift in his understanding, like a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place. You're not arguing against meeting human needs. You're questioning whether our solutions actually meet them, or just create dependencies that require ongoing management. I am questioning whether we have remembered what human needs actually are, Master Lao replied. Your ancestors lived for thousands of generations without antidepressants, yet archaeological evidence suggests they experienced less depression. They lived without global communication networks, yet their communities often showed greater social cohesion. They lived without advanced medical technology, yet many populations maintained better overall health. But they also lived shorter lives, faced higher infant mortality, suffered from diseases we can now prevent or cure easily. Some did, yes. Others lived quite long and healthy lives, while maintaining sustainable relationships with their environment. Master Lao leaned forward slightly, his eyes reflecting the candle's dying light. But my point is not that we should return to the past. It is that we might learn to distinguish between genuine solutions and technological palliatives that mask problems while making them worse. The bartender approached their table, politely indicating that closing time was approaching. Both men nodded understanding, but neither moved to leave. Something in their exchange had reached a critical point that demanded resolution, or at least acknowledgement. Distinguishing genuine solutions from palliatives, Bacon repeated. How would you propose we make that distinction? What criteria would separate wise intervention from harmful interference? Perhaps the same criteria that a parent uses when deciding whether to help a child with a difficult task, Master Lao suggested. Does this assistance build the child's capacity for future independence, or does it create dependency? Does it address the root of the difficulty or merely its symptoms? Does it serve the child's authentic development or the parent's need to feel useful? Bacon found himself thinking about his relationship with his graduate students, about the fine line between mentorship and micromanagement, between providing necessary support and stunting intellectual growth. Those are subjective judgments. Different parents would answer differently. Yes, but the questions themselves point toward wisdom traditions that have guided human communities for millennia. The Hippocratic Oath in medicine, first, do no harm. Indigenous principles of considering impacts on 7 generations. Buddhist emphasis on reducing rather than multiplying desires. These approaches share a common recognition that wisdom begins with restraint. Restraint, Bacon mused. But restraint in service of what? If we restrain our use of genetic engineering, people continue to suffer from hereditary diseases. If we restrain our development of renewable energy, climate change accelerates. If we restrain our research into artificial intelligence, we miss opportunities to solve complex global problems. And if we do not restrain these developments, what unforeseen consequences might emerge? Master Lao asked. What new forms of inequality, dependency, or systemic vulnerability? The question is not whether to act, but how to act with wisdom, rather than mere cleverness. The other couple had left, and the bartender was now cleaning their table with obvious patience but clear intention. The evening was ending, yet both men seemed reluctant to abandon their exploration of questions that might never find complete answers. Wisdom rather than cleverness, Bacon said slowly. I think I understand the distinction intellectually, but I'm not sure I know how to apply it practically. When facing urgent problems that demand immediate response, how does one cultivate the long-term perspective that wisdom requires? Master Lao smiled, and for the first time all evening, Bacon sensed something approaching compassion rather than challenge in the older man's expression. Perhaps by remembering that every urgent problem arose from previous solutions that seemed urgent at the time. Perhaps by asking not, how can we solve this quickly, but how can we live with this wisely? Perhaps by trusting that consciousness capable of recognizing problems is also capable of discovering responses that serve the whole rather than merely its parts. They sat in comfortable silence as the candle finally guttered out, leaving them in the soft glow of the bar's security lighting. Neither man had convinced the other, yet both seemed changed by their encounter, as if the conversation itself had become a form of mutual education that transcended winning or losing. The river finds its way to the sea, Master Lao said finally, rising from his chair with fluid grace. Whether through granite canyons or gentle meadows, it reaches its destination. Perhaps human consciousness is like that river, and our task is not to force a particular course, but to trust its deeper knowing while removing obstacles to its natural flow. Bacon stood as well, extending his hand in farewell. Perhaps. But I still believe we have responsibilities that require active engagement with the world's problems, even if we can't foresee all the consequences of our actions. Master Lao took his hand warmly, and perhaps that engagement itself is part of the river's course. Perhaps our conversation tonight was necessary for both the river and the landscape it moves through. They gathered their belongings and walked together toward the door, stepping out into the cool night air where the rain had finally stopped and stars were beginning to appear between parting clouds. Each man went his separate way, carrying questions that would outlive any answers they might eventually discover.